Well, good morning and welcome to the Palm Springs Drive Church of Christ, where we worship God, study His Word, love one another, and reach the lost, all that we might grow to God's glory. If you're visiting with us, we're especially grateful to have you among us and so glad that you came to worship God, who is worthy of all worship. If you'll open your Bibles to Psalm 1, we'll read a few verses there to start. In Psalm 1, verses 1 through 3, it says, "How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and in whatever he does, he prospers." First, I want to say Happy New Year, and that it has now officially been 15 years since I began preaching for this congregation. I am so thankful for your love and your encouragement. I know the math just doesn't seem right, does it? It is. I did the math. Got the calculator and everything. So, really so grateful for your love and your support, your encouragement over the years, especially the last few years at the height of my health challenges. I'm grateful for your love for God and your desire to hear the truth even when it's hard to hear, and to be challenged to continue growing more into the image of Christ. My personal mission statement as a preacher is to help people learn, love, and live God's Word. And you all have made that mission a joy, and I just can't imagine being anywhere else. Amen. As Paul said to the Philippians, "It is only right for me to feel this way about you all, because I have you in my heart." Well, tomorrow we start our daily Bible reading plan for 2025 from the Old Testament wisdom literature. And the plan is called Firmly Planted by Streams of Water. And you can find the plan on our website by hovering over the DBR 2025 tab there and clicking on the DBR 2025 button from the drop-down menu. And from there, it'll take you to this place where you can click here and download the schedule, which we actually have physical copies of the schedule available for you in the lobby. And also on this page, you can see there's a summary of each of the 5 books of wisdom, so you can just get a basic overview there. And if you'll click here, this is where it'll send you to a list of recordings on YouTube to listen to. And we're also working on making these available as Apple Podcasts and on Spotify, but apparently there's like a process, and we didn't really know this. You have to go through with Apple to get approved before they, put you on their platform. So we're working on getting it approved. It's not quite there yet, but you can still listen to them on YouTube by clicking here on this link. The recordings will be 5 minutes a day. And if you have any questions about how to actually access the recordings on your device or on the website, right? Or maybe there's a platform that you just prefer. Maybe you don't really like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Maybe you prefer a different platform. If so, get with Ryan Park on that. He'll answer any questions that you have, and he'll be able to add it to another platform potentially. He's not here today. Unfortunately, Carrie Ann and Asher are sick, but he says if you want to call him or text him and have any questions or issues of clarity, he's there to help. Now, before we start the Psalms tomorrow, I recommend clicking here to download the PDF called the 5-Step Process for reading the Psalms, because that's the process that I'm going to be walking you through in the recordings every day, Monday through Friday, as we go through the Psalms. Now, Psalm 1 is really a perfect starting place because it invites us to soak in God's wisdom, to become like trees firmly planted by streams of water, which is such a beautiful picture of mental and emotional and spiritual stability. The tree has firm roots, so the wind and the storms don't topple it over. It has constant access to fresh water, which makes it internally vibrant. It's not empty or dried out or hollow on the inside or cracked. It's filled with life and vitality, the proof of which is seen in its productivity, giving life to the world through its fruit, season after season. And trees are also some of the oldest and longest surviving parts of God's creation. And Psalm 1's invitation is, don't you want that kind of stability in your life? The opposite is found in the wicked. who reject God's wisdom. In verse 4, he says, "The wicked are not so, but they are like chaff, which the wind drives away." Chaff refers to the light and flaky casing around grain. So after grain is harvested from a field, it's taken to a threshing floor where the grain is separated from the chaff, or the wheat from the chaff. And you can see the chaff there on the bottom left-hand corner of that picture, and the wheat in the top right. You might also see this when you eat popcorn. You see like the little flaky, pieces of popcorn. That's chaff. And once they separate the wheat from the chaff, well, part of the process of separating that, one way to do it is to take pitchforks and just throw it up in the air. And then the wind just blows the chaff away, and then the heavier grain falls to the ground. Well, if you're the chaff just blowing in the wind, wherever direction the wind's blowing, that's the opposite of stability. One writer, if you appreciate physics, you'll appreciate this. He did a whole article on something called dynamic stability. But I thought this diagram was really helpful to visualize the difference between stability and instability. He argued that when we are unstable, like the ball at the top of this hill, he says, quote, "small disruptions drive dramatic changes. But when we're stable, like at the bottom of this hill, disruptions to our lives, well, they don't do much to us. Now, they might knock us off center, temporarily, but then we'll always just come right back to equilibrium." While his illustration is helpful, I think Psalm 1 is even more powerful. Because a tree isn't rocking back and forth like at the bottom of a hill, like in that illustration. It's firmly planted. Now, yeah, the branches, right, might sway in the wind, okay, but the trunk and the roots are all stable and immovable when the trials and the winds come. And that is what God's wisdom does for us, which is a tremendous blessing. Because there's so much instability in our world. There's moral instability because relativism says, there's really no right way to live your life. And there's a lot of emotional stability because in the absence of a moral standard, people are just relying on their feelings, which change all the time. And there's an identity crisis and people have no idea who they are or how they're supposed to live or what they're supposed to do. There's also political instability with a volatile economy and the threat of war on the horizon, and social instability because we're just so polarized and individualized and we've lost our sense of community. And there's mental instability all around as well. So many voices. We've been lied to so many times we don't even know who to believe anymore. And Psalm 1 says, "Come, and I will give you true stability in every sense of the word." And the awesome thing is God's wisdom speaks to us from multiple angles. God's wisdom is not simplistic or naive. It is very nuanced. There's a lot of that talk in our culture today, which I think is very healthy, that a lot of our problem in politics is our thinking is way too simplistic and not enough people bring up nuance. Well, God is about the nuance. He's not simplistic. And so, in order, though, to appreciate the nuance of God's wisdom, you need all 5 books of wisdom from the Old Testament. Because if you just have one, you're going to get a skewed, simplistic perspective. But if you want true stability, you need all 5. So here's a way to illustrate that. A great way to enhance your TV, if you care about TV, a great way to enhance your TV viewing experience is to add a surround sound system. If you're just using the TV speakers, you're hearing very one-dimensional sound. You're hearing the dialogue pretty well, and you get a little bit of the background noise. But when you add a 3-channel system, well, now you're hearing more of the environment that the characters are in. So, if they're at a park, you're hearing the birds chirping and the skaters passing by, and you're hearing, dogs barking. But not only are you hearing more from the environment that they're in, it gives you a sense of directionality. So you actually know where the sound is coming from the sides or from the bottom or from the top. But then if you add 2 more speakers and you create a 5-channel system, well, now sounds are also coming from behind you, which makes you feel like you're right in the middle of the scene with the characters. That's what God's wisdom literature is like. It's like this immersive 5-channel surround sound system where each book speaks to us about a different dimension of God's wisdom, the combination of which makes us very stabilized and balanced people, like trees firmly planted by streams of water. In fact, let me give you this definition of stability to work with this morning. Stability comes when God's wisdom gives us the knowledge and skill to flourish in life, even when life falls apart. So let's go through these 5 books of wisdom in the Old Testament and see how they each give us stability in a unique way. Psalms gives us the stability of connection to our Creator. The Psalms are a collection of Hebrew poems used as songs and prayers by Israel. And the writers are praising God, and they're pouring out their hearts to Him in deeply honest prayer, connecting in relationship with the Creator of the universe. And so in Psalm 46, 1 and 2, in verse 10 also, he says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth should change, and though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea. Be still, and know that I am God, and I will be exalted among the nations, and I will be exalted in the earth. The curse of sin makes this an unstable world, where things are changing all the time, and it can feel like a roller coaster ride that's just making you sick, and you just want to get off. But the Psalms connect us to God, so that despite whatever ups and downs come our way, we can be still. We can be stable, because we know God never changes. Before the Lord's Supper this morning, Aaron led us in a song that Herb taught us on Wednesday night, You Do Not Change. The last line says, while days are flying, you do not change. When we are dying, you do not change. Waking or sleeping, safe is your keeping. Ending all weeping, you do not change. Psalm 102, same idea. Of old you founded the earth, God, and the heavens are the work of your hands. Even they will perish, but you endure. And all of them will wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them, and they will be changed, but you are the same. And your years will not come to an end. You know, it's a general principle in life that you become like the ones that you spend the most time with. And so if you spend your time around very unstable people, and they can never keep down a job, and they're happy one day and they're angry the next day, and they're totally unreliable, and they never keep any of their commitments and all that, eventually that's going to rub off on you. Okay, but if you spend your time around stable people, you will become more stable too. Well, daily connection to our Creator in prayer gives us stability, because no one is more stable than God. In fact, He's so stable, He's often referred to in the Psalms and other scriptures as well as a rock in which we can take refuge. So here's a great one, Psalm 62, 1 and 2. My soul waits in silence for God only. From Him is my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I shall not be greatly shaken. The psalmist is stable and unshaken because he has an intimate relationship with God, who is stable and unshaken. Now, some of you may know I practice Wing Chun Kung Fu. Luke and Sterling and Jonathan and Will are all training with me now, so they can attest to this principle. But there's a concept in Wing Chun called root, where your connection to the ground is so strong, it is very hard for someone to push you backwards. And it's very easy for you to push them backwards across the garage. Let me say this. The longer that you train, the stronger your root becomes. And it's something you just have to feel. You know, if you come up after me, maybe I'll push you around if you want, just to feel it. Okay, but I've only been training 7 years, so my root's not even really that strong. But the longer you train, the stronger it becomes. There's a grand master who passed away about 10 years ago. His name is Chu Shong Tin. He was a very skinny guy. Yet when he was in his 80s, he would go around performing demonstrations like this, where multiple guys who are much bigger than he is are trying to push him backwards, but they cannot do it. Now, what's even crazier about that is when you realize he is standing on one leg. See, that's his left knee jutting out like that because he's not standing on his left foot. He's just standing on his right foot. Now, this seems impossible. That's AI, they're faking that. But there's actually a logical scientific explanation for it. It just takes decades to be able to develop this kind of root. And I'll tell you what he's doing. He's doing two things. One, he is relaxing his body, because a tense, rigid body is very easy to be toppled over. If you tense up like this and someone pushes you, you're just falling right down. So he's very, very relaxed. That's the first thing that he's doing. Secondly, he's taking their forward force that's coming at him this way, and he is redirecting it into the ground. So the reason they can't push him over is because they're not actually pushing him, they're pushing the ground, which cannot move, by the way. You try to push the ground, it's not going to go well for you. And it's why when he does this demonstration, and you can kind of see the judge behind him looking down, but when he does this demonstration, he's standing on a scale, so that whenever people are pushing on him from the front, the needle on the scale jumps. You can see it better in this picture. And there's the judge there in the grayish, outfit with the microphone. He's looking at the numbers on the scale jumping upwards, because the more this guy pushes on him, the more he's taking that forward force and he's just sending it into the ground, which again takes decades, right? So the question is, how is he doing that, right? And that's what we all ask when we're trying to train. How can I take a shortcut to do that better? I don't know that there are shortcuts. It takes a very long time. It takes a lot of skill. Okay, but it's such a fantastic illustration of what the Psalms are teaching us to do. Because the Psalms teach us whenever there are forces coming at us in life that are heavy and they just feel so impossible to deal with, you need to do two things. One, you need to relax. Because you start freaking out in fear and anxiety and you're tense and, I can't believe this is happening to me, you're going to be easily toppled over by the trial. And then the reason you can relax is because you have faith and you are connected to your Creator. So it leads you to do the second thing, which is when that impossible force comes at you, you redirect it not to the ground, but to God. And you take the trials and the problems and you give them to Him. And you trust His power to help you deal with those things. So essentially, whenever Satan tries to push us over, he's not really pushing on us, he's pushing on God, who cannot be moved. And because we're connected to the God who cannot be moved, then we cannot be moved either. And I'll just borrow from the Proverbs here. And I have this whole thing where Wing Chun relates to Christianity. Because God's wisdom, it's like an operating system in our world that operates in the natural world as well. So you can see these principles, even in martial arts and physics and whatever else you want to bring from God's world. So let me borrow from the Proverbs on this. From Proverbs 12:3 says, "A man will not be established by wickedness, but the root of the righteous will not be moved." Psalm 1 tells us right up front, if you want stability, root yourself in a relationship with God. That is stability. Secondly, Proverbs. Proverbs gives us the stability of a simple choice. Turn with me, I'd like us to actually turn in our Bibles to Proverbs chapter 1 in verse 7. Proverbs 1 in verse 7. Very important principle right up front in this book. He says in verse 7, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction." The book of Proverbs presents us with a simple choice. I'm either going to do things my way or God's way. And the invitation right up front in this verse is to realize I will never have wisdom until I realize it comes from God and not from me. And so look in Proverbs 2 and verse 6. Proverbs 2 and verse 6. He says, "The Lord gives wisdom. From His mouth come knowledge and understanding." This is really the challenge every day, is to remember that wisdom does not originate with me. It originates with God. I can be super clever. I can have a really high IQ. I can have a lot of life experience. I can have fancy degrees behind my name, but none of that matters. All that matters is fearing and honoring and respecting the Lord and His wisdom, because His wisdom is so much higher and greater than my wisdom. And that's why you keep reading. Look in Proverbs 3, verses 5 through 8. He says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil, and it will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. If you think about it, Proverbs is just transporting us back in time to the Garden of Eden and putting us back in Adam and Eve's position. Because they were given a simple choice between two options. Either trust God and do things His way, or trust yourself and eat from the forbidden tree. But the thing is, God's way actually leads to life. But their own way led them to death. In fact, he says this about wisdom. If you continue reading in Proverbs 3 and verse 18, he says wisdom, and he personifies wisdom as a woman. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who hold her fast. Doing things God's way, it's like eating from the tree of life, and you'll be blessed with peace and safety and honor and riches and success and long life, Proverbs is telling us. On the other hand, if we do things our own way, he says, and I'll put this one on the screen, Proverbs 14:12, there is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And let me tell you why this concept is so stabilizing. There was a psychologist named Barry Schwartz who wrote a book in 2004 called The Paradox of Choice, Why More is Less, in which he noted that most people think that having many different choices in life is always a good thing. You know, you go into Starbucks, how ridiculous would it be to go into Starbucks and say, look, we've got black coffee and then we've got coffee with creamer in it. That's it. Right? We'd say, what are you talking about? Where's my choices? I want dozens of options. I don't just want two. But Schwartz argues, actually, in many occasions, in many cases, having too many choices in life is a bad thing that can actually cause stress, anxiety, and regret. It can lead to paralysis by analysis, where we overthink things because we're afraid to make the wrong decision, or afraid of missing out on some other decision that we could have made. And then once we finally make a decision, well, then we're constantly thinking about, well, should I have chosen, one of the other 100 choices that I had? Did I really make the right one here? And think about how many choices that moral relativism provides for people in our culture, that you can just adopt whatever moral framework you want. Some people say, go with your gut, trust your instincts. Some say, hey, do what makes you happy. Some say the ends justify the means. It's all about the greater good. Some people say, do whatever minimizes suffering. Or, do whatever you can get away with without getting caught. I mean, there's so many different moral frameworks that people operate under, and that can be very disorienting, and it can make you feel kind of aimless. And yet Proverbs just kind of simplifies it and says, actually, there's only two options. There's God's way, and then there's the wrong way. And if you follow God's way, things will go well. And if you follow your own way, things will just fall apart. And the more we read the Proverbs, the more our senses become trained to differentiate between God's way and the wrong way. And it's incredibly stabilizing to just know the choice is simple. And I know exactly what path to take here. Now I understand God doesn't answer every question. There might be some things, should I move to this city or what? Okay, it's going to take some work and some effort, but Proverbs helps shape our ability to realize, really, it's just, is this God's way or not? That's so simple and so stabilizing to have that as your framework. But we need more of God's surround sound wisdom here, because Proverbs is a little too simplistic if that's all you have. And so we have the book of Ecclesiastes, which is the stability of letting go of control. Now we start to see the nuances in God's wisdom, because if you were to just read Proverbs, you get the impression almost that I'm in control of how things go in my life. If I want things to go well in my life, well, then I just do things God's way and it'll all work out. But God understands life in this sin-cursed world isn't so simple to be able to control the outcomes in life by our inputs. It's not as simple as Proverbs presents it, where you do good things and good things result. That's generally true, yes. And Ecclesiastes actually says it's better to be wise. Ecclesiastes actually acknowledges, yes, you should actually try to live God's way and walk according to the wise path of Proverbs. But Ecclesiastes shows us it just doesn't guarantee that things will go well for us in this life, because so much of this life is out of our control. So let me give you an example, just kind of a good summary of what's going on in this book. He says in Ecclesiastes 7, 11, and 12, wisdom along with an inheritance is good. And it's an advantage to those who see the sun, for wisdom is protection, just as money is protection. But the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of its possessor. So again, he sees wisdom as beneficial. He doesn't just say, well, life is meaningless, so it doesn't matter. It's not like nihilistic thinking. He's like, no, it's actually a good thing to be wise, because generally speaking, it prolongs your life and it protects you, from disaster and all that. But then just a few verses later, he says this, but I've seen everything during my lifetime of futility. There's a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in his wickedness. Now, if life was as simple as Proverbs presents it, this wouldn't happen. You should see that, if this is a righteous man, his life should be longer. And it's the wicked man who should die young. But that's not always the case. It's why Proverbs are not promises. They are general principles. But if we don't have the wisdom from Ecclesiastes in our hearts, we'll be completely unstable when we see terrible things happening to the righteous in this world. Even more so, when we'll be unstable when terrible things happen to us and life is falling apart, even though we're walking the wise path of Proverbs ourselves. This is why I said stability helps us flourish even when life falls apart, because Ecclesiastes is telling us it is guaranteed that at least some part of your life will fall apart. And in fact, he goes further and says, all of our lives are going to completely fall apart in the end because we're all going to die. That's really the hardest pill to swallow. That you can live a perfectly righteous life and you can do everything God's way, but in the end, we still die like the wicked. And sometimes we die sooner than the wicked. And we still die like the animals. And so, what's really the advantage of being a human and an animal? This is what Ecclesiastes says. So he says this in chapter 3. The fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts, the animals, it's the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there's no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Now, he's not getting into, the theology of heaven and all that. He's just saying from this earthly perspective, animals die and they get buried in the backyard, and humans die and they get buried, maybe not in the backyard, but, they get buried too. And so he's reminding us, even though it's not pleasant to think about at all, it gives us tremendous stability to remind us there are so many things we have no control over in this world. And the more we try to manipulate and force life to work out the way we want it to, the more angry and bitter and frustrated and unstable we become. In fact, many people, and Ecclesiastes talks about this, many people try to control this earthly life by forcing it to give them happiness and satisfaction. And so I'm going to go out and I'm going to chase money and I'm going to be the richest person in the world, and then I'm going to have satisfaction and happiness, and I'm going to have more sex than anybody else in the world, with more women than anybody else, and that'll give me true happiness. And these are all things that Ecclesiastes is saying, yeah, but none of that works because it's vanity. The word he uses is vanity, which literally means smoke or vapor. So like smoke, you can see it. It's there, and hey, I can go out and conquer the world and be the richest and most powerful and enjoy the most pleasure than anybody else. But it's like smoke, because when you try to grab onto smoke and you try to hold it and you say, all right, I got it now, it just all wisps away. And you're left with nothing in the end. And ironically, as depressing as that sounds, it's actually the key to true happiness and satisfaction. Knowing that we can't do those things and we can't force this life to give us satisfaction and happiness because we aren't in control. That actually is what brings us happiness and satisfaction, especially when we know our true happiness comes from God. And so he says, just like one verse later, I have seen nothing is better than that man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. He's saying, because things are going to happen that are awful and are unfair and seem totally random and out of our control, the best thing to do is enjoy and soak in each present moment as a gift from God that can disappear at any time, and we can actually be okay with its disappearance because our ultimate joy can only be found in Him, the one who never disappears. Well, we need to go a little further in our surround sound wisdom from God by looking at Job, because Job gives us the stability of trusting the one who actually is in control. Look with me in Job chapter 1, and verse 1. And this verse is very interesting, especially when you compare it to Proverbs. I can find it in my Bible. All right, there it is. Job 1, verse 1 says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. Sounds just like Proverbs, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, right? Turn away from evil. Trust in Him, all that. Job did everything right. He's walking the path of Proverbs, fearing the Lord. Yet everything falls apart for Job. He loses all of his money. All of his children are killed by raiders. And even his health falls apart. Job is a real-life case study of the unfairness that Ecclesiastes talks about. But Ecclesiastes wrestles with our lack of control, whereas Job wrestles with the God who actually is in control. Because the question is, does the random unfairness of life here mean that God doesn't care about us? Or does it mean that God is not powerful enough to deal with it? I mean, if God wanted to, He could have absolutely programmed this world like Proverbs, so that everything works out every time. If you do good things, then good things happen. And if you do bad things, well, then bad things happen. But this whole concept that you can do good things and bad things still happen to you, well, that's just very destabilizing. Right? That's just very like, what in the world is going on? What kind of God would allow that to happen? And it causes people, when it happens, to doubt God's existence, to doubt that God cares about them, and really to just abandon God completely when their life falls apart. The book of Job helps stabilize us by reminding us the universe is far more complicated to manage than we think. The universe is not so simple as, again, that input-output proverb system. So much more going on, and God knows exactly what He's doing, even when we don't. When Job basically says to God, I just want my day in court with you, so I can argue my case, and I can tell you how unfair, and how unjust you're being to me. God responds to Job at the end of this book, and it's kind of terrifying if you're Job. So let's turn over to Job 38. Let's listen to how God responds to Job's accusations of his unfairness, and God, you're not running the universe right. So verses 1 through 7 in Job 38. And I don't know God's tone here. I try not to picture Him as like super angry, okay, but there's definitely some condescension here, okay, because God is so much greater than Job. So anyway, he says, verse 1, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me, Job, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? Or what were its bases were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Basically, God's response is, you don't have anywhere near the understanding and the wisdom to question the way that I run the universe. It's kind of like a little toddler saying to their parents, why did I have to follow that rule? Yeah, that's unfair. You don't know what you're talking about. And the parent just kind of has to say, and my dad always said that to me, well, I'm 50, right? Especially when I was a teenager, he'd say, well, I'd complain about something. Why do I have to do this? Because I'm 50. It's like, well, God's saying, because I'm infinity to Job, right? Because I know way more than you do. I've been around longer than you. I'll be around after you. And you know what? He spends 4 whole chapters, God does, explaining how much higher His wisdom is than Job's. And by the end of those chapters, Job realizes what a horrible mistake he made. And he repents. And Job says this, in the very last chapter of the book, Job says, therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. And interestingly, after this confession by Job, God restores all his money, all his possessions. He restores his health. He gives them 10 new children. Why? Because Job shows us some wisdom can only be learned through suffering. And because God is so wise, he actually used Job's pain to teach him wisdom, which ended up leading him to even more blessings in the future. That's incredibly stabilizing, because when we are confused about why we're suffering and it just seems so unfair, we can know we're not alone. Job knows what that's like. Jesus knows what that's like. He was the only truly innocent sufferer of injustice. And we can know that God isn't confused about it at all, even when we are. He is in control. And God is actually trying to bless us with wisdom we never would have had we not gone through it. And finally this morning, the Song of Solomon gives us the stability of a loving marriage. One of the major causes of instability in our modern culture is the breakdown of the family unit. You got rampant fatherlessness, high divorce rates, and hookup culture. It's all incredibly destabilizing. Yet the Song of Solomon reminds us of the beauty and the power of the loving one flesh union in marriage. In fact, it uses garden imagery to describe it, inviting us to think of marriage as this haven of safety, like it was for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden before sin entered the world, where man and woman can be naked and unashamed, and they can walk together with God and delight in their devotion to one another. This book was written primarily to young women, just like Proverbs was written mainly to young men. So the bride here tells her virgin friend something 3 different times in the book. She says in chapter 2 and verse 7, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you do not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. She is warning them not to awaken sexual love before the proper time in marriage. And that is so stabilizing, and it's exactly what people need to hear today. Let me give you this illustration. We're trying to get it to stand up. When we are sexual with our spouses in marriage, we are taking 2 people and we're essentially gluing ourselves together so that the 2 become one in multiple senses, not just physically, but also emotionally and mentally and spiritually. And that is a beautiful thing. But that marital sexual union is protected by our vows and our commitment, which makes that sex safe with one another. Our culture talks a lot about safe sex. The only true safe sex, according to the Bible, is the one that is protected by the bond of marriage. But here's the thing, and I went ahead and actually used glue on a couple other pages here. I didn't want to be dealing with glue up here. It was going to be a disaster. So the thing is, if you join yourself sexually to someone that you are not married to, and it's just a one-night stand, or maybe it's just a fling for a little while, and you go your separate ways, you end up broken. You end up with pieces of the other person still stuck to you in a deep spiritual sense. And it's painful. And it just breaks people. And there are some people, they do that so often. I mean, they're kind of numb to the pain, but it's so destabilizing. And the Song of Solomon is trying to bring back the stability of true, loving sexual union in marriage. And it actually speaks about sex in marriage as something beautiful. Because it can be destabilizing for Christians to get married, but then some Christians still view sex as dirty or shameful or worldly. But the Song of Solomon celebrates it as something to be enjoyed because it was created by God to be for our good. And it also reminds us, even though marriage is not totally based on feelings, romance is a wonderful thing. And we should compliment our spouse, and we should go on dates and do what we can to keep the romance alive and to enjoy one another. And so you have verses like this, how beautiful you are, my darling. How beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves. And then she responds, how handsome you are, my beloved, and so pleasant indeed. Our bed is luxuriant. Is that how your marriage sounds? Right? Sometimes you get comfortable with each other and you're just roommates. Song of Solomon says, no, you're not just roommates. you're partakers of this beautiful union designed to be an amazing blessing by God. And it's going to take work, right? It's going to take effort. Okay, but it's this amazing thing. And I realize single people might wonder, well, what's the value of this book for me? Well, it's because Paul says in Ephesians 5, marriage is a reflection of our relationship with God. And just like love in marriage can be so exciting and sacrificial and sometimes completely irrational in its willingness to do things for the other person's benefit, that's the kind of wild and radical love God has for us. And that is incredibly stabilizing to know that you are loved more than you can possibly imagine, and to know you have a stable home with God. That is God's surround sound wisdom. And Psalm 1's invitation is soak it in so that you will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water. Do you have the stability of God this morning? Or are you like chaff just blown around in the wind? This morning you can come to God and you can soak in His wisdom. But first, you've got to admit that you need salvation. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so you've got to admit this morning, I'm going to honor the Lord. I'm going to honor His Son as my Lord and King. I'm going to believe in Him. I'm going to confess His name. I'm going to repent of my sins. I'm going to be baptized in water for the forgiveness of my sins. You can do that this morning and have the amazing stability of a tree firmly planted. And if you've done that already, but maybe you've been discouraged because you were operating on too simplistic a system. Maybe you were operating on a proverb system and you thought, look, I've been doing all the right things, but things keep going wrong for me and things are just falling apart. And so maybe God doesn't care. I invite you to make sure you got the third channel and the fourth channel and the fifth channel so that you get that full surround of God's wisdom and bring the balance and stability back to your life. But that's only going to happen if you repent and you say, God, like Job did, God, I've spoken about things too wonderful for me. You know what you're doing, and I'm resubmitting my life to you. If we can help you do that in any way, come forward and let us know how while we stand and sing.